When you're programming in Ruby, never underestimate the power of the standard library. Always make sure before you start looking for a gem or anything else to look through this documentation and see if it has what you need. It's more than likely it does. And just adding dependencies that are completely unnecessary to project is really a bad practice. Recently, I was reading through this documentation and I realized that it has pretty much everything you need to build a web framework from scratch using only the standard library documentation. And so that's what I'm going to do in this next series of videos. I'm going to show you how you can build a fully featured web application framework from scratch using only the standard library. That includes database, testing, rendering views, the whole works. So to get started, I've already set up a GitHub repository, and I'll be using tags as I complete the episode so you'll be able to follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL to the clipboard, and we're going to clone that repository now. And all that's in it right now is a README file. So you can see that we're starting completely from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up in the Atom text editor here, and let's get started. So, just like any other Ruby project, the first thing that we need is a gem file, something that lets people know that this is a Ruby project. Even though we're not going to have any dependencies, we still need to have this gem file, and it's a good idea to also specify which version of Ruby we're using, which I believe is 2.3. You look in our terminal to find out for sure. It is 2.3.0, the very first release, which just came out recently. So we're going to go ahead and run bundle to make sure that works. I just installed Ruby 2.3, so I don't even have Bundler yet. So let's go ahead and install that now. And now we can run bundle. Okay. So that created our gemfile.lock. And the reason that this is important to specify a gem file, even though we don't have any dependencies, is so that we can tell it exactly which version of Ruby we're using, so we know which version of the standard library that our project depends on. If we don't do that, and down the road some of the libraries that we're using are removed from the Ruby standard library, it could cause issues. And if we don't know which version of Ruby to fall back on in order to make it work, it could cause even bigger issues. So that's very important. So let's go ahead and add that gem file and gemfile.lock to our Git repository and commit it. And I'm going to go ahead and push that up to GitHub now. So the next thing I want to do is get a basic file structure going. So let's start by creating a place to store our source files. Create a directory called lib for that. Something that we can put configuration files in. Another folder for executables. And lastly, for now, we'll want a folder to store test files. So the next thing we want is an entry point for our applications framework. So for that, we're going to create a file under lib called framework.rb. And in this file, we'll include all of the standard library dependencies. So for example, if we wanted to use ERB, we can require that here. And we'll also have a namespace that will name framework. And any of our the rest of our library will be namespaced under this module. We'll also want a version, so we can track which version of the framework we're using. So let's create a new folder called framework, and in there we're going to have our version file. So we're going to put this, of course, under the framework namespace, create a constant named version, and we'll have version 0.0.1 as the starting version number. And what I'm going to do is, for every episode, I'm going to increase this patch version by 1. So this is episode 1, and you see that's version 0.0.1. And the next episode, of course, will be 0.0.2. Next, we want a way to actually test our framework, so let's create a test helper. And in this file, we're going to load any of our test dependencies. And Ruby actually comes with a standard library called Minitest. So that's what we're going to use for this. And if we require minitest/autorun, what that'll do is anytime one of our test classes is loaded, it'll automatically run the tests that are in that class. Next thing we need to do is load the framework. So we use require relative for this, and just go to the previous directory /lib/framework to load our framework. And we may change that down the road to something a little bit more elegant, but that works for now. And then we, of course, will load any of our test files, and we can do that just by loading or searching through the current directory. So we just do file.expandpath, and what that'll do is it'll get the current directory of the script, of the test helper.rb file. And it's important that we load the current path of the test helper.rb file and not just the current directory we're in, because we may be running the tests from a different folder within the test directory. Okay, and you can just search for anything under any directory. If the file ends in _test.rb, we'll consider that a test file. So we'll go ahead and just search through that and load those files. That'll load all of our test cases. And if we run this, the way we can do that is pretty simple. Just go back to the terminal, just say ruby test/test helper, and we can see that it runs Minitest automatically. Of course, we didn't actually load any test files, but it did the trick for us. So that's the file we're going to be using. Actually, this is more of a test runner than a helper, so let's go ahead and rename that to test runner rather than test helper. And yep, that should do it. So let's go ahead and start testing our framework right now. We'll go ahead and test. We don't really have anything to test except to make sure that our framework is loaded and that our version is loaded and that it returns a string. So let's go ahead and set those 3 tests up right now. So to do that, we can start by creating a test file called framework test.rb. Create a new class called framework test that descends from Minitest test. And to create a test in Minitest, all you have to do is create a public method that starts with test underscore. And we'll just call this one test framework is defined. Create an assertion that checks if framework has been defined. And we could go ahead and run that now by running ruby test/testrunner.rb. We can see here that it found the test and that it passed. So next we want to test that the version is defined and that it returns a string. So we can do that by creating a new folder called framework, where we're going to put a new file called version test. And in here we'll put this under the framework module, and we'll say version test descends from Minitest test, and we'll have 2 test cases. And we'll say test version is defined, and we'll have another one called test version is a string. Okay, so this assertion is the same as the last one, so we're just going to test framework version is defined. And then we want to assert that it is a kind of a string. go ahead and run that now. And we can see that it didn't pass. And that's because we didn't actually require that version file. And the way you can see that here is there's one failure and one error. It's always a good idea to look at the failures before you look at the errors. So we'll look at the failure. It says that test version is defined, and that fails. So we know that version is not defined. So of course, if it's not defined, it's not going to be a string either. So let's go ahead and fix that now. And to do that, let's go ahead and open this back up. And like I said, in this module here, in this file here, this is where we want to require all of our framework's dependencies. So let's go ahead and require relative framework / version. And when we load this, or run the test runner again, you can see that all three of our tests pass. So that's all I have time for in this episode. To recap what I set up, I created a basic project folder that has a testable library, or the beginnings of a testable library. And before I commit this to my repository, I want to make sure that in my empty folders I create a file called .keep. And what that's going to do is allow me to commit an empty directory to my GitHub repository. If I don't have that .keep file in there, it'll see an empty directory and it will just delete it. So that's it for this episode. And in the next one, I'm going to show you how you can actually get set up with a web server that will actually start serving some HTML and JavaScript and CSS files. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.